So I have back in the studio our Kim Ji-yeon and of course Professor Schattle of Yonsei University. Now, so it definitely seems like the Yonsei campaign had anticipated a larger margin of winning margin, I suppose. But they were a bit disappointed with the early exit poll numbers. Now, it is just now with 42.8% of the votes counted that they are picking up, their excitement again. And as they see Yoon Suk-yeol really picking up at the winning pace over Lee Jae-myung, why do you think the exit poll numbers were so close, beating expectations?
Yeah, it's hard to say, I think, for the Democratic Party that the fact that they were much more in the fight than some expected those exit poll numbers would show. And I thought it was very telling earlier when we were hearing reports from Yoon's camp that the mood there had become quite subdued after the exit polls came out. So that's quite the giveaway when you can see the faces in the crowd looking grim at that moment. It's been interesting tracking the numbers coming in all night. I know you said we're now about just over 40% of the total votes counted, Kan-young. And I'd like to know more about the remaining 60% and where those districts might be, because that will give us a clue, I think, as to whether this remaining 60% will possibly put Lee Jae-myung solidly over the top, or as you were suggesting, that support for Yoon might be picking up. I mean, it's possible that in many of the outlying areas, which seem to be voting more heavily for Yoon, that those ballots will take longer to get in and be counted nationally, although there's fewer of them. So, I'd like to see a little bit more of the data here as it comes in to have a better sense on which way this may go. I think it's too early right now to call the race one way or the other.
Right, because it is so neck and neck. Right, so that was the numbers that we saw as the vote count goes underway. Votes are counted. Now, the race between the two men had been so plagued by a series of scandals and marred by mudslinging between the parties that some in the electorate took to calling it a contest between two unlikables. Still, more than 3/4 of South Koreans cast their vote, rivaling voter turnout from the country's last presidential election in 2017. I will speak to our Kim Ji-yeon here and Professor Schattle more about this phenomenon. Now, there was a broad consensus among polling experts that younger voters, especially in their 20s, will likely determine the winner in the election. But rival candidates did have trouble connecting with them, although they did make last-ditch efforts to get to them. Now, unlike past generations, these voters are not easily swayed by traditional election issues such as regional allegiance or loyalty to political bosses. Did we see the generation or the age gap, demographics, play a factor in this election?
Well, I've been teaching these people for quite some time now, and I've been hearing their frustrations for the better part of 10 years. And I'd say that the people in their 20s, and we could include some of the early 30s segment here as well, they've been postponing a lot of aspects of life. I mean, we've heard so much about this. People postponing getting married, postponing buying apartments, postponing having children, maybe even postponing relationships, and looking for some changes in the society that will kind of give them the chance to move forward in their lives the same way that their elders did. But I'm also struck by how pragmatic the younger generation is as well. They're not, staunchly in favor of one party or the other. They're looking to kind of carve out their own way. And I think I would say they're interested in social welfare policies for the young, but also interested in having a strong national security posture at the same time. I mean, many of this, North Korea didn't really factor much into the election at all nationally, but especially for these younger folks, because they're used to South Korea being its own little island. Even if that may seem unnatural to those of us that are older, they're accustomed to that, and they simply want to be left alone by North Korea. So that too that issue is not going to move the younger generation the same way that it moves people one way or the other to their elders. And I think we end up with the younger generation somewhat split, as we've seen along lines of gender too, with women going in favor of Lee Jae-myung this evening and men going by and large for Yoon Suk-yeol.
Right. Ji-yeon, you also spoke briefly about this phenomenon. What are you reading into this?
Right. So one of the certain things that we can see about the exit polls we just showed in the screen right now is what Professor Schattle has mentioned, that the 20-something male have been predominantly voting for Yoon, while the 20-something female voters had predominantly voted for E. And we can infer from this that there was a gender issue playing here in this election, that rather than the issues that Professor Schattle had mentioned, like by region or security or diplomacy or economic issues aside, it's surprising that compared to the presidential election 5 years ago, gender have been a key factor here in these exit poll regions. And anti-feminists, you have to understand, had claimed that the country's bid to address gender inequality has tipped too far in the women's favor, while feminists, they say there's widespread sexual violence, entrenched gender expectations. You look at the low female representation in politics or in boardrooms, you can see how discrimination against women is still rife in the country. And these are the predominant factors in the exit polls that I've been seeing today playing a key part in the presidential election.
Right, right. And I suppose some would argue that candidate Yoon Suk-yeol was insensitive about some of these women's issues and some of these feminism issues. So I suppose that is where he lost his 20-something women voters. Well, thank you, Chung-min, for that. I remember last presidential election 5 years ago. By this time, President Moon Jae-in, the president-elect Moon Jae-in then, was already out at Gwanghwamun. He was already celebrating with his supporters, and he had already delivered his victory speech. So you can imagine how close this race is. 5 years before that, I think we had already called out the winner. Park Geun-hye had already called her victory. So this is a really tight race. With 54.9% of the votes counted, we still have a neck-and-neck race between the two main candidates. 48.4% for Yoon Suk-yeol, 48.1% for Lee Jae-myung. So 0.3 of a percentage point difference. That is way too close to call. Really. So we have a population divided right down the middle.
Yeah, it's a nail biter, and I think maybe these outlying provinces are going to be very important. The central regions of the country, as we were just seeing in those numbers, if they continue to go very heavily for Yoon, that might spell well for the PPP. On the other hand, if Lee Jae-myung can do well in Gyeonggi-do, as he seems to be leading so far, and if he can pull up his numbers in Seoul a little bit, it's been very tight there. That we have half the country just in Seoul and Gyeonggi-do. That could also bring Lee Jae-myung further ahead as we go on. But you're right about the way the country's divided as well, Kan-young. And I was looking at the numbers, the exit polling segmented by age and segmented by men and women. And we were talking earlier about how people in their 20s, the men went almost 50%, 60% actually for Yoon, and the women went almost 60% for Lee. What's very interesting is you get to some of the older generations, people in their 40s tonight. If the exit polls are to be believed, they were the strongest segment for Lee Jae-myung. And if you think about that age group, they were young. They were kids in the 1980s. They were teenagers in the 1987 democratic movement here. They watched the country democratize. And I think a lot of their trajectory in life prompted them one way or the other to go for the DP tonight. Whereas the elders, as they so often do, they went for the more conservative side. And the people in their 20s, the men are going more for the people in their 60s, following their grandparents, it seems, toward Yoon in this election. Whereas people in their 20s, they followed people just a step ahead of them in their 40s with more democratic sensibilities, going for the DP. So, we'll have a lot to, I think, sink our teeth into after this election, looking at more about the roots of this division, both by age and by gender.
Right, right. So the older generation going for Yoon Suk-yeol, the more conservative. These are the people 60 and above. These are the people who have perhaps witnessed, experienced the Korean War, the more conservative ones. Those in their 50s and 40s, maybe they're the ones who have experienced the democratization of Korea, those who perhaps, made Molotov cocktails and, really threw them and took part in the demonstrations of South Korea. And those in their 20s split by right down the gender line.
Well, rather than the gender line, though, but what was surprising for me is, before the votes were counted, both the DPK and the PPP projected that the election would not be split by region this time. They cannot be so wrong, because when you look at the region, there was almost a 10 percentage points between Yoon Suk-yeol and Lee Jae-myung in Gangwon provinces, Chungcheong, Bukdo provinces, and the Chungcheong Namdo provinces, where 5 years ago, Moon Jae-in at this hour had a really strong lead. But now, it's flipped over to Yoon Suk-yeol. So that tells a lot about regional votes this time. It's split.
Right. We'll have to wait and see, because the race is so close and neck and neck. Now, about 58.8% of the votes counted. Now we have Yoon Suk-yeol with a 48.5% and Lee Jae-myung with 48.1%. So 0.4 of a percentage point. We will continue to see that votes be counted, and still that is a very neck and neck, and this could go on all night, well into the morning. I haven't seen a race this close in a very long time. Well, thank you so much for staying with us all throughout, Ji-yeon, of course, and Professor Han Schattle. Thanks so much, and we will see how this turns out.